Hello, everyone. So in the name of BRIAS coordinators, BRIAS colleagues, I'm officially introducing this week's seminar, this Thursday seminar. So we have the pleasure to welcome Leandra Bias today for her talk. But I'm going to let my colleague introduce our guest speaker a bit more in detail. But thank you very much for being here. And thank you to the audience for being here today in this very sunny and warm day.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vjosa Musliu. I am a professor of international relations at the Democratic Futures Research Group at the VUB. On behalf of Professor Silvia Erzel, who is the co-convener of BRIAS, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Leandra Bias to the Brussels Institute for Advanced Studies. Dr. Bias is a Swiss National Science Foundation Ambizione Fellow at the University of Freiburg. Her research examines how gender, democratization, de-democratization, and political violence interact with one another. Regionally, Leandra specializes in the formerly communist Europe. She is the recipient of the European Consortium for Political Research 2023 Yoni Lewandowski PhD Prize, and her active engagement in science communication was also recognized with the 2022 Young Scholar Award from the Walter Benjamin Colleague. Today, she will present her all brand new book, Under Authoritarian Eyes, Feminist Solidarity and Resistance in Russia and Serbia, published just days ago by the Oxford University Press. BRIAS is therefore very pleased and honored to have the very first book talk of this important contribution in the field of post-communist studies, post-communist European studies, but also feminist solidarities in two slightly different, but at the same time very, very similar contexts that Leandra will tell us more about. Dr. Bias will present her work for about 40 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A discussion at the very end. Leandra, thank you very much for taking the time to come all the way from Freiburg, and also for giving us the great pleasure to be the very first hosts of your important book. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vjosa. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. And the pleasure and honor is mutual. It's very humbling to be here for the first book talk. And so it's like a double first. I have a newborn at home and this one in print. So it's a lot of excitement around. Now, the way I will go about presenting the book is in 4 parts, not equally distributed. I'll introduce you to the puzzle and the main argument. I will then run you through feminist priorities in both cases under the condition of authoritarianism, how this then informs their new strategies, and finally make a connection to the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and the relevance of the book for that discussion too. So to start, what the book does, it revisits a quite well-established argument in what I would refer to as critical theory on transnational feminism, where discussions about power relations are paramount. The argument, I can't do it possibly justice, I'm boiling it down, but the argument being that in transnational feminism, transnational feminism is essentially a unidirectional knowledge transfer of Western feminism to other parts, including former communist Europe. It is about, this transfer happens in order to establish and cement asymmetrical power relations, and the effect is that local knowledge is silenced both in the past and in the present. And with regard to former communist Europe, it is said that that dynamic was in particular started with the end of communism in order to reify the Western superior position. So that is the argument that is established in critical theory, summed up very, very shortly. And I refer to that, to the phenomenon or the argument around Western knowledge transfer. Now, what happened? I read up on that, and I was very interested in that argument. And so those were the hypotheses or the expectations with which I also went into the field, so to speak. But what happened is that I encountered a lot of incredibly angry reactions. I was treated at best naive, at worst as a nuisance, and someone who was saying incomprehensible and dangerous stuff. And to illustrate this, I show you a quote from a Russian respondent back in 2014, which was as patronizing as it will sound. "You are too late, my dear. That debate may have been relevant and fashionable in the early 2000s. Now it seems out of touch." So where was the argument out of touch? What was it not seeing? Well, the thing is, once, and that took me a long time, once I stopped assuming and started to really listen what interviewees were telling me, I realized that in times of authoritarianism, there is a completely different axis of power that becomes salient for feminists on the ground. It is not the transnational one between the West and them. It is the domestic one between them and the regime. Because what the regime is doing, it is built inherently on an anti-Western and anti-gender discourse, in which it does say gender equality is a Western invention, a perversion. Most of the time also it is framed as a neo-colonial imposition. And so under those circumstances, the critical argument, even if it comes from a very different origin and has very good intentions, starts ringing dangerously similar. And that was what they were reacting to. And so instead, under these circumstances, feminists' priority was not lying with battling around power asymmetries with their Western peers, but much more to avoid that risky resonance with regime discourse, and ideally even try and counter it. Now, when I say risky discourse, it's this discursive dynamic that I'm referring to. So you would have at the top the regime discourse, and at the bottom you have the critical feminist discourse. And they are, as I said, they are different. They have different origins, different circles, and different aims, but there is an echo between them, and that is the one that the feminists are reacting to. The echo being, the risky resonance being at least around 3 points. Both discourses have in common the idea of Western dominance, the idea of a unilateral knowledge transfer to assert that dominance, and finally, a third thing, the need to therefore resist. And so what the book does is, and this is really important to me, it's not a dismissal of previous critical scholarship. It is very much, I consider myself a critical scholar myself. So it's much more to say, I think we've missed something in a specific historical juncture, and therefore we need an update. That update being that we need to take the lived experience under authoritarianism into account, because otherwise what can happen is that we don't realize that arguments that were developed for emancipatory reasons can actually be reappropriated, and in the worst case, they can even contribute to feminist subjugation. And the argument that the book does is grounded in, as you could guess by now, a comparison between Russia and Serbia, where the unit of analysis were the feminist discourses in both cases, for which I conducted over 70 interviews, but also drew on archival material and publications at certain points. I did that between 2014 and 2020, so before the full-scale invasion, and we will get back to that. And importantly, I also did it across different generations within each case. So it is also a within-case comparison to how, on how the different generations treated the subject. For argument's sake, why the two cases? Well, it was an interpretive design, so you don't fix variables before, but you go with a hunch of what could be important similarities and differences. One important argument for me was that while both have, of course, very different communist pasts, both countries share the fact that they were the dominant nation in the ethno-territorial federation, and that therefore there is this sentiment of a lost empire which causes revanchism. They also act according to critical theory as important others for Western Europe, and both conduct what I said, anti-gender politics, like this anti-Western, anti-gender discourse. However, Serbia is also still in the accession process to the EU, which makes authoritarianism more subtle. At the same time, it has also, back in those days, at least with my research, it had gone through a recent violent experience of war, and Russia not yet, to some degree. And so the Serbian case actually helps us to see that feminists can pick up tendencies even when they are not so far progressed yet, depending on the experience they have had. Now first, what do we mean when we say anti-gender politics? That was the environment in which they were bathed. Well, anti-gender politics will always have two dimensions, a discursive one, and therefore symbolic, and a material one, so manifested in policy. And importantly, it is used for the own authoritarian regime to legitimize itself. Now, how does that work? What the regime does, it says, what I mentioned earlier, gender equality is not about universal values, it is a Western ideology. It is employed strategically to undermine us. So it leads to falling birth rates, increased divorce rates, to say it simplified. And importantly, by reappropriating post-colonial arguments, it is said that it is yet again an instance of Western neocolonialism. And so if that is the argument, right, then all of a sudden, well, rejecting gender equality or even attacking feminists becomes an instance of self-defense. And even more so, if that is just a Western ruse, then perhaps that goes for democracy and human rights altogether. All of that is now just a cynical tool of power employed by the West. So you end up in a situation where authoritarianism and the defense of so-called traditional values becomes both noble and necessary. And that was the environment already back then when I entered fieldwork. Of course, to different degrees, and I will get to that now. So, anti-gender politics in Russia. Well, in Russia, what you had was, in particular, an increasing securitization of these so-called traditional values ever since at least 2013, when the Russian Security Council said, I think we need a strategy for moral defense, up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, where one of the arguments was we are also invading preventively to avoid gender equality or gender ideology to swap over into Russia. So that has been an ongoing development, and in policies it manifested through different laws, the most important at that time being the Foreign Agent Law, so which imposed on any NGO that was receiving funding from abroad and was politically active, that never being defined, to declare themselves as foreign agents. The anti-gay propaganda law, which did not allow discussions of same-sex relationships in front of minors, which you can imagine made it difficult to teach, including at universities. And then the decriminalization of domestic violence back in 2016. While in Serbia, it was less overt, precisely because of the ongoing accession process. And other scholars have called this the phenomenon also of double discourse. So what happens is they say to Brussels, here we are, one thing, and another thing to the audience back home, often with these tokenistic gestures. And a recent example illustrates this very well. So for those of you who followed, in 2022, Europride was cancelled, and it happened at the same press conference when it was then also announced that the openly lesbian Brnabić was going to be appointed a third time for prime minister. So you cancel one, but here is the token, right, for you. And on a policy level, this double discourse would translate into, for example, sexual education textbooks, which had been developed over years by the Ministry of Education together with feminist NGOs. And just weeks before they were published, the minister had to step down, withdraw the books, and confess publicly that this had all happened because of pressure from Brussels. It also manifested in natalist campaigns where citizens were encouraged to come up with slogans to encourage women to have children and would get awards. And this would include slogans like "Stop talking, start laboring," lovely things. And a very controversial approach to pride marches, including the cancellation that I just mentioned now on Europride. But essentially, with every pride, a conversation started, this is a homosexualization of our streets that we don't want, etc., etc. And in other years, it was allowed. So this back and forth. Now, given this political reality, what was then feminists' lived experience in Russia that they reported to me? And already back in the days, the key concern that came up throughout the interviews was repression. And repression in the cases that I talked with, that I saw, could range quite a bit. You had more benign cases of an artist whose painting was confiscated when they did like a parade with paintings in the street rather than an exhibition, because no gallery would have them. But even that, right? Even that was not allowed. And so a painting which you would think is very harmless was confiscated, but she was okay. You have a criminalization of gender studies over a decade, which essentially led to not a single one of them operating. And so here I start with an anecdote from my third field research in Russia, which was actually also very tragic. I was supposed to be affiliated with the Moscow Center of Gender Studies, the longest, oldest in Russia. And before going into the fieldwork, we kept like emailing, logistics, la la la. She kept telling me, we have no office. And I was like, I thought she meant she doesn't have a desk for me. And I thought, well, I'm a PhD candidate, don't worry. I don't need a desk. I can go to a library. And this several times until she went back to me with all caps, like, we don't exist, like we don't have a physical place anymore because we have just been essentially declared a foreign agent. So that was the start. And precisely because of that, they literally had to close doors. And yes, they then lingered around digitally for a few more years, but essentially without a place where you meet, it's very difficult to continue activities. Similarly with the Ivanovo Center for Gender Studies, where I then did fieldwork a few years later, the director one day she came up and she saw all the belongings thrown out of the premises. The reason given that there was a sour smell coming out of that office. The keys were never returned to her, and she first transferred all the books to a private apartment. She was then subsequently, because she was herself a professor at that university, made redundant 2 years later, the accusation being that she was systematically absent. And she brought the case in front of court, won the first time, but in the appeal round she lost. And sadly, she tried to keep activities somehow going with summer schools, and even a Christmas quiz in 2021 on gender equality was raided by the police. So again, just an illustration of how little tolerance there was. But sadly, she passed away last year. And so I also think without Olga Shnirova as a force around to keep battling and finding pockets of activism, I highly doubt that it will continue existing in any form for the next few years. And finally, even at the semi-private university in St. Petersburg, gender studies have been criminalized first for similar reasons, like they were saying the university doesn't comply with fire safety, when really the target were that they were offering gender studies. And so they have also been closed de facto since 2020. Funnily, on the English website, they're still there, but not on the Russian version of the website. But so this is to illustrate that was one very strong instance of repression. And I also had cases where activists were arrested, questioned, and one of them even imprisoned for several years. So that was the key concern. And it is also conveyed in several quotes that I have which show how what for them it meant to be a feminist, what feeling that does, and it's an overwhelming feeling of being targeted. So you have like instances where they said, well, okay, it's just difficult to get through brainwashed people. Then you have others more in the middle who say, well, I'm aware that I work in a dangerous field, up to the point where interviewees would say, well, actually I feel I'm being exposed to a campaign against me. So this real feeling of encroachment. And so if that was the reality, the political environment in which they were operating, then it won't come as a surprise that the dominant reaction, the dominant feeling was also fear. There was an acute awareness that if they were being targeted, it wasn't in any case coincidental, but it was very much because they were essentially embodying that gender ideology the regime was vilifying. So their main concern, to put it simply, was repression and the fear this caused, and not power relations with Western feminism or Western feminists. And their new strategy, therefore, centered around avoiding this risky resonance I referred to before, and ideally coming up with images of transnational feminist community and knowledge production that would counter what the regime was propagating. While in Serbia, given precisely that there is a double discourse and less this like overt repression, the key concerns were more like disingenuity, so disillusionment with a government that keeps professing this double discourse, and a double discourse which actually is more harmful than it might seem at first sight, because it also hides active obstruction by the government against gender equality. So they would report that there are government, like NGOs that are close to the government that are created on purpose so that they fight for the few crumbs that are left. There is a civil society that feels ghosted because the government will say, we have consulted civil society in its like reports to multilateral organizations, but they would invite civil society organizations with a day's notice or not read their shadow reports. Or they will say that we have a publicly funded SOS hotline, but for 5 years there was no money ever paid. All of these instances, so actually active obstruction. And all of this happens still with the EU giving credibility to that government. So there's also disillusion in what was once supposed to be a strong ally. And this is then coupled with a very strong sense that what they are living is a regression, because you have life in front of you, a rehabilitation of war criminals. And of course, President Vučić being the primary example, because he was Minister of Information during the war against Kosovo. So not only did he intimidate independent media, but he was the one actually making sure that the propaganda justified the violence by paramilitary police, and many others who have been rehabilitated since. So there's also this sense of a nationalist revival, which I can illustrate with this quote. Although they are full of EU human rights, if you listen and if you look at them carefully, you will see that they didn't change at all. It's only that cosmetic change, that kind of, well, I'm going to say in public what they want to hear, but basically it's very violent politics, very nationalist politics, and very dangerous politics as well. And that feeling was really prevalent across the interviews in Serbia. And as a result, what then the dominant reaction is disillusion. As one interviewee told me, the only good thing is that there is no war. The rest stayed the same. And I think here what's also critical to understand is that there was in Serbia almost no longer, let's say, I call it liberal interlude. I mean, Russian feminists would also disagree with me to the degree that this was liberal, but at least it was longer. You know, you had the 90s that were somehow more liberal, while in Serbia you had the ousting of Milosevic, and 3 years later the democratically elected leader was murdered. So almost no possibility to take a breath. So what many of them were reporting was just extreme exhaustion and fatigue, when you feel that there has been either no progress and in many instances even regression. And so while the cases differed, like the concerns differed in the two cases, at the end, in both cases, feminists came to the same conclusion. Our main aim is avoiding to emulate regime discourse and ideally try and subvert it. Now, how would that subversion happen discursively? As a reminder, the 3 points they wanted to avoid was the idea of Western dominance, the idea of unilateral knowledge transfer to cement that dominance, and thirdly, the idea of resistance. And from this, 3 discursive strategies were derived. The first one would emphasize, would keep with the idea of, yes, there is a knowledge transfer, but there is agency in that transfer that we are having. And what we are receiving or drawing from that is solidarity. The second one would reframe knowledge transfer to knowledge exchange among equals. And the third one would just completely counter the very idea that there is something like Western and Eastern feminists and that therefore stuff can be transferred. They were very much like, no, this is a common thing. And obviously, I can't possibly run through all 3 strategies in both cases across generations. So I'm just giving 3 examples, for one each. The first one would be the wartime generation in Serbia. And so the wartime generation in Serbia, for instance, would really speak of the instances of the experiences they had of transnational feminism in the 90s as something that was characterized by very profound solidarity, but importantly one where they felt they took initiative, they had agency in it, and they were not some passive recipients of that. And so to illustrate that, in fact, the 3 major feminist NGOs still operating today in Serbia were established, among other things, thanks to support in different forms received from Western feminists. The first one, the Autonomous Women's Center, was created to help victims of wartime rape. And part of that story was that first 2 Swiss gynecologists traveled to Serbia and spoke to survivors, spoke to doctors, and to activists. And once they realized, okay, there is a willingness to create an organization that would accompany, support these specific survivors, they invited them to Switzerland for a training for 2 weeks. And importantly, the more durable effect of all this was they did fundraising to buy a house where that organization could be located. And it sounds like small, but that is still the house where they operate today, and which under other circumstances might have been extremely difficult. And what they reported was that felt just like, first of all, we could leave the international isolation. We could finally feel that we could get active and do something. And it wasn't something that was in any way or form perceived as an imposition from abroad. While the Women in Black Belgrade, so the biggest pacifist organization in the country, was inspired when the Women in Black Italy traveled with a caravan through the region, and they realized, oh, that could be an example for how we can peacefully protest our nationalist regime. So in short, it is to say what they reported was very much Western feminists were responding with emotional, practical, and financial support to things, to aspirations and needs that we brought, and not something that was externally imposed. While the young generation in Russia would reframe precisely this idea of knowledge transfer into, no, this is a knowledge exchange, and an exchange among equals, because we actually have our own feminist history and heritage too. And more importantly still, they would convey very clearly that they are angry, but they are angry at their own foremothers. So that this is an internal battle and not an issue of a silencing Western feminism. And an illustration of that would be the book they published in 2020 at the occasion of 40 years since the first self-published feminist publication appeared in the Soviet Union, where you could really, like, a few of the texts were full of anger at the, let's say, previous generations in the 90s, which was, in their view, so naive to believe in democratization that they just threw out socialist feminism together with socialism, when that feminist heritage would actually nowadays be much more relevant because the repressive circumstances are much more similar. And so what was really important here was both, at the one hand, we have pride in our own rich history, but which we had to unearth ourselves, and therefore we are angry at the preceding generations who just thought that this was no longer relevant. And finally, for the third strategy, we go back to Serbia. So this is where they just completely refute the idea of geographical borders that would be necessary for a knowledge transfer to work. And interestingly, this was really present across generations, actually, in Serbia, and much more present in Serbia than in Russia. And what they would say is that really, like, the idea of geographical boundaries in feminism is ludicrous. It is an idea that is employed strategically and purposefully by the regime to create divisions. And if anything, we are really bound in a backlash in anti-gender politics that is not a phenomenon of Serbia or Russia, but very much global, a global phenomenon. And so we have much more in common that divides us. And here, because this was such a strong reaction, it really also shows that that is a consequence of what some of them would even refer to as the anti-nationalist DNA that they have. Because of the war and because of the very violent divisions that they experienced almost overnight across ethno-territorial lines, this is something that they vehemently want to avoid from happening again, and is therefore also the core differences that came out between the two cases. So a stronger earlier reaction, even though, objectively speaking, the circumstances were still less acute than they were in Russia. And with that, I go to just quickly the connections to today's ongoing war against Ukraine. So obviously, the data for the book, as you could see, was collected, apart from the conclusion, was collected way before the full-scale invasion. And therefore, the book does not answer, for example, how feminists have reacted since the full-scale invasion, or why, in the case of Russia, they never really cared so much about their country's foreign policy. That will be for other researchers to do. But what it does offer is really a journey into over a decade before the full-scale invasion, and demonstrates how the priorities for feminists in those two cases had already radically shifted before. So way before they were already saying, our core concern is not power asymmetries on the transnational level, but the domestic power axis, something which, given recent developments, is bound to have dramatically increased. And so what the book does, as I said, is not a dismissal of previous scholarship. On the contrary, it is an invitation and a call for us to rethink critical theory, given the historical juncture of authoritarian regimes, which very often also are built on anti-gender politics. And importantly, I think critical theory on transnational feminism might actually even become more relevant if we are ready to rethink what we consider relevant power relations. What if we move away from West and rest and even go and say power relations exist in East to East? What if we acknowledge that there are important power relations between Russia and its former colonies? Then we will maybe realize that for a future of transnational feminism in the region, between Russian and Ukrainian feminists, for example, to be possible, there will have to be a very self-critical reflection on behalf of Russian feminists on the power relations they were embedded in and how they have benefited from them and perhaps even reproduced them. So I end with that call for all of us to rethink and let go sometimes of previous assumptions, even if they are comforting. And I thank you very much for your time and attention. The book, I should have mentioned, is available open access. So with just one click, you should be able to read beyond the acknowledgements. And I will, of course, also be happy to stay in touch, ideally beyond this conversation during the coffee break, but also online through different channels.
Thank you very much, Leandra, for this succinct, thought-provoking, and very important overview that you gave us on the book. And indeed, I started to flip through the book at the beginning of this week. I'm always through with it. And even though you mentioned at the outset that a lot of this was researched prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I think it is a very sobering read, and in a lot of ways it does read a bit as a warning as well. It is a very scary roadmap when you actually read it in light of the secret agents legislation that has been just passed in Georgia. For instance, you do see the walk through to it. But it also makes you think of more subtle silencing, definancing of gender studies departments, research groups all around East and Western Europe as well, because we saw images of some of these academics being taken outside, but there are also less invasive yet utterly powerful moves to actually silence discussions about gender, and we are seeing that all around us. And I think the book, especially because it has been written based on data from a different context, it does provide you with a sobering read and somewhat worrying in the positive sense as well. So you have two cases which in a lot of ways, both Serbia and Russia act as leftovers of some varieties of empires seeking revanchism. And more often than not, as we see, a lot of this revanchism is also oriented towards the female subject, towards the womb, towards the reproductive right as well. It is no surprise to see that a lot of the socialist legacy with feminism and with gender equality is actively by both regimes overwritten and completely sidelined. It also made me think quite a bit of the significant differences that varieties of socialism could have on this. In the case of Russia, that was more obviously sidelined as something that belonged to the past. It was also, to a large extent, criminalized as well. Whereas in the case of Serbia and in much of the former Yugoslavia, because of its membership in the non-aligned movement, there was still this lucidity as to what was still useful to keep in. And again, since I see many of my IPE students in here, only one of these two countries would have their leaders make commercials for Pizza Huts and not the others, which I think also explains the enthusiasm with liberal capitalism in general. There are two more important elements that while I was reading I had to think about, and then I will close my reflections on this. There are currently around 30 anti-war feminist movements operating in Russia. Many of them are grassroots, many of them are loosely organized in the virtual and the non-virtual space. The research of our affiliated colleague Maria Zayeva has actively shown how, in what conditions they operate. Many of those feminist movements, however, are actively silent when it comes to solidarities with mothers in Ukraine or with the victims of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think that's also important to note. And at the same time, what we see in Serbia post the fieldwork of your research is that by all estimations of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Transparency International, Youth Initiative for Human Rights, civil society organization has become even more encroached and curtailed than what it used to be. So if we got a grim picture in those quotes, unfortunately the situation is grimmer now, and this has also been shown in the infamous memorandums of the ongoing current student protests as well. I will leave it here, and I hope I provoked you enough to go and download the book and get a proper read at it. I will now open the floor for your input, for your questions. If you can raise your hand, and I'll be there in no time with a mic.
Well, okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. It's also a very sobering story that you come to tell. It's maybe a bit of a speculative question, but your research is mostly focused on feminist movements and feminist types of resistance. Do you think that the same types of power dynamics that you witness also apply to like other fields? Like I'm thinking about climate research or these things. So to what extent is it, well, maybe not generalizable, but does it also apply to other fields as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this often, the question often comes, or also is it similar in climate or in unionized movements, for example? But what I will argue is, first of all, I did not do the research, so I don't have the data to actually substantiate the claim. But I think the huge difference is that if you then look at the regime discourse, this does not happen with, the same vilification does not happen with climate science or with worker unions. It's really a discourse that is specifically using gender equality as a shortcut to then dismiss human rights and democracy and legitimize itself. So that is one important aspect. And the second one with Russia, the only thing I would add here is that what sometimes happens, because you don't have just an instrumentalization of gender equality in regime discourse, you also nowadays have a very important historical revisionism. So that would be, for me, one that is similar. So references to history are also very important for regime discourse, but that does not translate into social movements and important power dynamics between them. So I do think there is something exceptional in transnational feminism here.
Hello, thank you very much for this very, very inspiring and interesting talk. I know, unfortunately, very little about critical feminist studies, so I may be asking a stupid question here, but I'm reading Judith Butler's Who's Afraid of Gender? And she goes for a while into, let's say, the religious influence on scaring people about gender equality. Did that figure at all in your research?
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't touch upon it. It was already very present in Russia at the time, because what most people refer to is really the clear authoritarian turn happening after what maybe some still remember the Pussy Riot trial, which also happened after the back then biggest protest Russia had actually seen, when it was clear that presidential elections had been rigged and Putin was coming for a third term. And so that was when the collaboration between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Kremlin really took a close knit, and when Russian diplomats also started systematically using arguments from the Russian Orthodox Church, including in the UN. So your hunch is not stupid at all, is in fact very correct. The interesting difference was that until recently, I would say until the Europride ban in 2022 in Serbia, feminists would often tell me it's not, it doesn't come from the Orthodox Church in Serbia. This is more fringe. It's more the far-right parties that are pushing this, and Vučić also thankfully taking it up. But this also really changed. Like with 2022, you now start to see the Serbian Orthodox Church being very active and very closely connected to the government, sadly. So, yeah, you're right. There is a religious dimension in that.
Thank you for your talk. It was very inspiring. I work on gender inequalities mostly in the Western context, and I know surprisingly little about non-Western cases, so this is very insightful. But when I always think about post-communist countries, and I can be very wrong in that, but I often, in my naivety, think, okay, communist ideals are, well, based on senses of equality. So in my head, that should coincide also with gender equality. Then I'm thinking about, and I think I'm very naive in it, in chances of opportunities in education or certain fields. And then I'm a bit puzzled, how did we end up here? When you have that, those ideals then that should be entrenched in communism, and then in exactly those places, then you see those things happening. So I was wondering, like, do you have an idea of what type of forces are on the ground of going from those ideals of equality to then, the abolishment of those like gender institutes and so forth. So, I'm not really aware of but I would be interested in what you have to say about that.
Yeah, and what you're describing is still very widespread also assumption about what communism was in reality. The first kind of counter anecdote would also be the same issue happens with democracy. The first revolution we had also immediately gave rights to all men and not to women. And with communism, even if that was on paper, I have an entire chapter on actually transnational feminist encounters in both cases when it was still the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, because the implementation of that was partial, to put it mildly, and you already then had in both cases independent feminists, not movements but actors who were showing that. And one example would just be, okay, in theory there is a right to abortion, but how that is put into practice in the Soviet Union is an entirely different story. And since you ask what is the force here, well, it's the elephant in the room, and it's called patriarchy. Right, and so that is very difficult to deconstruct and very pervasive in both cases. And of course, you can say the advantage with communism was that at least you had a vocal commitment to it. And actually, in the Yugoslav case, what you would see is that there were. Okay, now I'm getting nerdy. What is fascinating is that when they met with Western feminists back in the first International Feminist Conference in '78 in Belgrade, is that they got kind of angry at the feminists, especially from France and the UK, because they were constantly like, but you have to be independent, right? You're against the state, like, and they were like, no, we actually think the foundations of what we have here of the system is not bad. It's the implementation that is bad. So we are pushing for the state to live up to what it is promising, which was an interesting distinction back then, and which just shows once again, like, these were never tacit, timid recipients of any Western teachings. But yeah, I stop there.
Hello, good afternoon. Many thanks for your very interesting and inspiring talk, and I share the humble statements that we know surprisingly little about these movements of resistance, despite sometimes being interested in those in our country. So despite the geographical closeness, we are quite ignorant in what's happening in the countries you've studied. But you concluded on a global resonance with some of your specific observations, and I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit on that, whether in recent years during the publication of your book you've also been observing other contexts, and whether you could tell us a little bit more about similarities but perhaps also differences that you're witnessing now at the global level. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this ties exactly back to what Vjosa was saying in her remarks. Like, we are seeing sometimes you can call it like the Russia or the Serbian playbook, which is just being implemented in other contexts and sometimes in more subtle ways. So yes, in Russia you have the extreme case that gender studies were abolished in the end, but you had a slightly milder version of that in Hungary, right, before the recent elections, when it was essentially also almost impossible to conduct gender studies. But then you have my own country, Switzerland, where we would regularly be questioned for our, like, is there scientific merit in what we are doing? Is it really science? And unless you then have universities with a very strong backbone who defend that, well, it's a very slippery slope. So I would, if anything, I would probably say I can't think of a country where that has not happened in recent years, where we are again at the point of, and we are not even discussing now more progressive gender equality rights. You might have noticed I mainly speak of women's rights, something I would do differently now, we learn. But we're not even talking about queer rights, right? And but we are back at square one, discussing whether there should be access to abortion, whether abortion should be paid by health insurance, like. And those are these small regressive steps that are almost everywhere, sadly.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'll have a small question about the methodology, because you hinted towards the fact that it was very important for you to look at at age divides within the groups. So did you consider any recollection biases that might intervene? So I would like to know a little bit about this. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And this is actually one of the parts you won't find much in the book. It's the thing. Reviewers were like, too much into the fields. We no longer care about this. We trust that this went well. I was like, okay, it's clearly a different stage in research. But absolutely, especially when, we're talking with the 90s generation. I sometimes even had respondents who were active back in the 70s. So there is that, and yet you also then say, you still consider it as valuable insight, and usually it is for the older generation where I would try and have more triangulation. So this is where then their memoirs would come in, or interviews they had given at the time, to somehow see, okay, because there's not just that bias, there's also the bias that they probably, even if I'm a Greek-Swiss double national, they probably read me as a Western feminist, right? So there is those issues there, and we try our best with it. Yeah.
This is also across Serbia versus Russia in terms of recruitment of those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. This was surprisingly similar. It would not be today, but in both cases, I started with Russia. And in both cases, I went because that was easier in terms of access through established organizations. So as I mentioned, the Moscow Center for Gender Studies, and then other back then still existing gender studies, and then the organizations that would mostly work with victims of domestic and sexual violence. And only from there, and only once inside the country, I could then say, okay, do you have other people to refer me to who ideally will also disagree with what you're saying? And that's how I went by it then. And I had the same approach in Serbia. First through the gender studies, then through the visible NGOs.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes, thank you for your presentation, and it's really inviting to know more. So I'm personally more involved in the Serbian case, let's say, but mostly recent protests and student movements and everything happening after 2022. My question, as you also mentioned, abortion rights and the transnational dimension, that is something that is always telling a lot to me, and also a very ambiguous perspective, as you correctly phrased and rephrased. What's your opinion about the involvement that is not only Serbia, so let's say Southeastern Europe, if we would like to adopt this definition, of the transnational campaign My Voice, My Choice, because they deliberately choose to adopt a kind of global approach, so to also cover Russian, Serbian, but also Bosnia-Herzegovina approaches. Do you still consider it a Western approach, as it might be, because it's still under European Citizens Initiative, which is a purely European instrument, let's say, and an idea, a very EU-labeled idea of supranational democracy. So now we are in a kind of super gray zone. What's your
oh wow, you're catching me unprepared, because I have no idea about this initiative. I don't know the process that you're mentioning, so I will not do the question justice, but I would definitely say it is initiated and led by regional activists, right?
Based in Slovenia, actually, and working at the EU level. So Slovenia, let's say, as last or previous last EU member state going to East, so another cross-border ambiguous.
All former Yugoslavia, so not Bulgaria.
That's the point. They are reivindicating the kind of primacy, if we can put it as such, of abortion, having abortion in constitution in former Yugoslavia before any other EU member state or any other country. So this is their revendication as a Yugoslavian heritage.
Oh, I love that. That's fantastic.
Sorry, it was not my intention. Maybe it's a very recent case, because it was over the past 2 years. And it's also one of the very few, as I've been working under this instrument, European Citizens Initiative, in the past 15 years, is one of the very few considered as successful. This is also kind of one of the features. Successful, I mean, with a kind of positive outcome at the institutional level, at the European Commission level, but also having a broad engagement. But still, the initiative can be signed by EU citizens only. For example, Serbian citizens here with double citizenship, they can sign, but not those in accession countries.
Okay. So first of all, it's amazing that this initiative exists, and thank you for telling me, because what I remember from this story was just that France came out and said proudly, we are the first to have it enshrined in our constitution. And Yugoslav feminists going like, hang on, I think we were like almost 70 years earlier than you. So, and I think it's amazing that they want to have this recognized as a heritage. And my only reaction to this, because I really have not studied it more, would be, this is then the perfect example, right? It's the perfect example of them insisting that we will not be divided, even after so many years, across those ethno-territorial borders that nationalists have created. This is our common heritage, and we are using the small instances of leverage that the EU is actually offering, despite the disenchantment that we are feeling. So,
thank you.
We have time for two last questions.
Perhaps if just because you mentioned it in your comments that you have also a colleague who's done research on anti-war activism in Russia.
Unfortunately, Maria is not here with us today, but she has a book chapter coming up and an FAO proposal, fingers crossed, that we will hear more about in 2 weeks. But indeed, what she finds out is that there are 30 anti-war feminist and women-led movements actively operating in Russia. Some of them are in exile, but a lot of them, the overwhelming majority of them, are operating inside Russia, and they are very decentralized as well. So it's not Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's like the core Russia, the old core Russia as well. But many of them indeed show resistance to extending feminists, or even those who are, like, for instance, the mothers of the mobilized or the wives of the mobilized, to extend solidarity with mothers or with feminist movements in Ukraine proper, or sheerly acknowledging the ongoing occupation.
Resistance among the fellow activists.
Yeah,
exactly. So I wanted to go back to that because this is now not in the book. This is recent research, because I looked at. So I assume we're studying the same thing. I really want to meet Maria. The feminist anti-war movement that was established the day after the full-scale invasion, with this over 30 different chapters, both within Russia and outside, and they have their main communication channel is Telegram. And when I say I want us to extend power relations and how we view them to East-East, and when I say that I think in the future there will have to be a rethinking on behalf of Russian feminists, that was the question that drove me. It was like, okay, is there solidarity with Ukraine? Is there an acknowledgement of, well, Russia as an imperial force, and what does that mean for our own heritage? And the results that I come up with is that it is so far, apart from the really also indigenous activists, it is the only movement that has awareness of that. But then you really see this spike in the first 6 months after the full-scale invasion, and since discussions around that plummeted. And the question is really, okay, is this strategic? Precisely because there is resistance in the society, so if you want to create at least some momentum in an already marginal movement, that is a compromise, or is it really just, also reticence because it's a painful process? So, but something to look out for, I think.
Any last questions, interventions? Otherwise, you can continue this discussion over a new cup of coffee. Please join me in a round of applause to thank Dr. Bias for coming in her first international tour since the book and since the baby. So thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you so much.
That we have a final seminar on Monday. If you want to know more about the seminar on Monday, you can ask Luis, who's there, who's going to organize it. So it's going to be within the frame of the work package on sustainability. It's about a very big guest stars, but check on the website to know more about it and register to this final seminar. Thank you.